So we're going to start our process with understanding the brain's relation to consciousness. So consciousness for us is how we experience our reality. The first thing I want to talk about is the affective threat of imminent death. So threat of imminent death doesn't necessarily mean someone's going to kill you. So this applies to the fact that if a tiger is chasing you, there is a threat of imminent death. Now, being primates, we have two other threats that are potentials, in fact, that are coded into our DNA that run us as much as seeing a snake does. And that is safety and familiarity, as well as social survival, right? So two things primates have to have. Primates are the weakest of all predators. And so in that, there have been a couple of mechanisms that have been encoded into our systems to help try and keep us safe. So our brain is going to register that I have a threat of death first, and if I'm losing anything socially. So this is why, like, if it's the end of a relationship, if we're not having the right social status, anything that's driven socially. Now, in the primate level, this just means tribe. We have to have enough of a tribe to feel safe. But in human development, this has now become the right car, the right job, the right kind of relationship, the right group, the right religion, the right political party, you name it, right? So these are all social tribes for us. So any threat of losing our social position becomes a threat of imminent death. The second one, safety and familiarity. This is why a lot of people resist change. This is just a primal reaction of the brain. Because safety, we needed it, right? You had to know which berries to eat. You had to know who looked familiar, so you knew who you couldn't trust, who you couldn't feel safe around. You had to know what tribal boundaries were. All these things that we had to know as these systems were development. Safety and familiarity was huge. However, with 7.5 billion people on the planet, there is constant change. So we can't stay in what's familiar. So this has become a constant trigger for people, right? So when we talk about the trigger of threat of imminent death, we're not just talking about a tiger chasing us. Now the brain's going to react like a tiger's chasing us, but this could be losing social standing or losing familiarity, having to go into something that we're not familiar with. And then what this does is this triggers the brain chemical norepinephrine. It also triggers epinephrine and histamine. We're going to talk about that a little bit, but the norepinephrine specifically is stored in the synaptic vesicles and released under fight or flight trigger. So that's the state of consciousness we're talking about, is fight or flight. So this threat of imminent death triggers norepinephrine, which puts us in a fight or flight state. Now we have norepinephrine all the time. It's what makes us awake and alert and be able to focus and concentrate on things. But this is an additional release, right? So you're getting extra norepinephrine in the system. And again, I'll talk chemicals more in a minute. And the resulting state of experience of life is suffering. Every single thing you would define in your life as suffering is the result of a fight or flight trigger. This means if you're sad, if you're angry, if you're depressed, if you're frustrated, if you're sore, if you don't have motivation, emotional, mental, physical pain, all of these things are states of suffering, and they're all the results of these triggers. I'm going to get a little bit more into that. So we're going to talk first about the fight or flight state and what the body does. So at a physical level, what's happening is we have an enlarged amygdala. So the amygdala is the thing that triggers fight or flight. So it's the thing that triggers that release of norepinephrine, that extra release. The amygdala is where all of our emotional memory is, and it is the thing that is measuring that threat. So what happens if a person has what I call an overactive fight or flight response? They have an enlarged amygdala. Okay, and so what's happening is that means the amygdala is having a bit of a hair trigger. So it tends to mean we get triggered into that state of suffering easily, right? States of feeling insecure, conditions like PTSD, depression, anger, emotionally reactive is a really good way to think of an enlarged amygdala. If we're really super emotionally reactive, that's a state of the amygdala being triggered because it triggers heightened emotional response. So in this, again, the brain chemical that's released is norepinephrine, the neurotransmitter. And in this, I'm going to talk about the 5 major neurotransmitters. If I don't talk about it, it means it's a secondary transmitter. If you get the 5 right, the rest of the brain works well. So I focus on the 5 major neurotransmitters. So norepinephrine being the first one. The other 2 that are released with norepinephrine are epinephrine and histamine. So these are 2 more of the 5 major neurotransmitters. Now, epinephrine, we tend to understand what epinephrine does. So like I said, norepinephrine makes us awake and alert. So again, in a fight or flight response, we want more alert, more focus, we want to be as awake as possible, right? Because consider the fact that when you're in the state, regardless of your trigger, as far as your brain is concerned, a tiger's chasing you. So if you're imagining trying to run away from a tiger, your brain is going to have to be really alert, really focused, right? Really sharp. And so that's what norepinephrine does. Epinephrine is adrenaline, right? Norepinephrine is sometimes called noradrenaline. So epinephrine being adrenaline, we all understand that state of fight or flight, right? Where your heart races, your blood vessels contract so that you increase blood pressure, your body pumps out a bunch of sugar, right? Everybody talks about gaining weight from stress because your body pumps a bunch of sugar so your muscles can use that sugar to run harder or to fight better, run faster, right? So you pump out a bunch of sugar. All these things happen. You have that rush of adrenaline in your system. The other neurotransmitter that's released, that's one of the 5 major, is histamines. And this is what I want to talk about more today, that even than epinephrine, because we get that fight or flight response. But histamine is a thing that we often don't talk about. And I want to talk about what histamine does when we get triggered. So what's happening is the brain triggers this fight or flight response. All of a sudden, we're pumping a bunch of adrenaline, and the brain's consuming a lot of energy using the norepinephrine for focus. So a lot of times you'll hear statements like we only use 10% of our brain at a time. That's inaccurate. We use our whole brain, but we only produce enough electricity in our body to use about 10% at a time. So the body is an electrical machine. It creates electrical currents. It creates energy. Now, it only has a certain allotted amount of energy based off what we've created, right? And so the brain, when we're using all of a sudden all this adrenaline, right? We're increasing our heart rate. We're pumping a bunch of adrenaline and norepinephrine. And so what the brain does is start shutting down other systems in the body to conserve energy. The brain will literally kill us trying not to die because and it's just systematically doing what it knows to do. We don't have enough energy, so I'm going to start shutting down systems, right? So the systems it's shutting down begin with H1. This is our allergic reaction. Most people understand allergic reaction when it comes to histamine, right? We've taken antihistamines for seasonal allergies, or if somebody has a strong allergic reaction, they might get a shot from an EpiPen, that's epinephrine, or they might get Benadryl, right? These are antihistamines that we know about, which is the allergic reaction response. So what's happening is if a tiger's chasing you, your brain doesn't care if you're allergic to things, right? It needs to conserve energy so it can run from the tiger. Now, I'm going to have listed below where these histamines are stored in the body. I'm not going to talk about that. That's just there for people with specific medical conditions. They know these terms. And so if a person has certain problems with certain, like if they have smooth muscle problems, they know about that. And so I'm just letting people know this is the histamine that's being affected. So you have H1 allergic response. The second thing that shuts down is our GI tract. This is the H2 histamine, right? Fight or flight or rest and digest. The body doesn't want to be digesting when we're running from a tiger. Also, digestion takes an enormous amount of energy in the system. So the body shuts down the GI tract, right, when we're triggered. The third thing it shuts down is our central nervous system. Now, I don't know that it necessarily shuts them down in this order. I'm just saying the third thing because it's the H3. It might shut down in a different order for you. But this is our central nervous system. So basically, we're shutting down the ability to feel what's happening in the body. Because if you're running from a tiger and you're running through a forest and you're getting cut, your body doesn't want to feel that right now. It has to be able to focus. So our body shuts off those receptors from the central nervous system. This is why a lot of times when people have a car accident, they may not feel it for a couple days, right? It's not that they weren't injured the day of the accident. It wasn't that the body wasn't in pain the day of the accident. It's that the body shuts down the pain receptors as part of conserving energy because of the trauma. So the fourth thing it's going to shut down is our immune response, right? So this is why if people are stressed a lot, they tend to get sick, right? But immune response, again, I have to worry about my immune system if I'm running from a tiger. These are all systems that use energy, so the brain is shutting them down to conserve that energy. So what I want to talk about is what happens when we get histamine imbalance. So histamine imbalance means we might have an excess of histamines, a lesser amount of histamines. It doesn't mean a malfunction. It means the brain is shutting it off because we're triggered. We're triggering too much. But it's not a malfunction, but it's causing an imbalance because of the amount of times we're triggered. If we have an overactive fight or flight response, we're triggering too much. And so body's shutting off systems, turning it back on, and it's going back and forth. And so it creates an imbalance. Systems and conditions that result from histamine imbalance are weight disorders, skin disorders, GI disorders, anaphylaxis, ulcers, allergies, food disorders, motion sickness, leaky gut, nutrient deficiencies, blood vessel dilation, bacterial infestations, autoimmune disease, neurological disease, hormone imbalances, mood disorders, sleep wake disorders, cognitive function disorders, cancer, autism, overall body pain, seizure disorders, respiratory disorders, and asthma. Nearly every illness known to man is the result of a histamine imbalance caused by an overactive fight or flight response. The pharmaceutical companies know this. This is why when you see pharmaceuticals, a pharmaceutical that treats cancer might have the same side effects as a pharmaceutical that treats depression because they're approaching a histamine. They're trying to turn the histamines back on, right? And we're going to talk about why that can't completely work. But it does work to an extent, right? If I take Benadryl, it's going to stop an intense allergic response in my system. If I take an antibiotic, it's going to help my immune system. If I take something for pain relief, right? People take things for depression all the time and feel improvement. MAOIs worked for me initially, right? Until I got to the point where I no longer needed them, until I had more balance. So again, what's happening at a physical level is we have an enlarged amygdala, which is creating an overactive fight or flight response, which is shutting down systems in our body, which is then creating pain and sickness. Now, what's happening at this point is we are dying. So we've triggered a threat of imminent death, but now we're actually dying because the brain is shutting off critical systems that we need to live. And especially if you think of the fact, if you think of how much time in a day you spend stressed or depressed or anxious or unhappy, all of these are the results of that trigger. And if we're in them too long, our systems are shut off, right? So what happens on a mental level is we feel powerless, right? We have no control. We are subject to external conditions. We have depression, anxiety, stress, PTSD, addiction, mental illness. What's happening on an emotional level is we're vulnerable. Now understand the word vulnerable. The word vulnerable is used a lot to be authentic and raw. That's not what vulnerable means. Vulnerable means at risk, under threat, right? If we're vulnerable to something, we're at risk. And so we can feel, we'll feel emotionally vulnerable when we're triggered in a fight or flight response. We'll have anger, sadness, fear, pain, insecurity, lack of motivation. We feel expendable and alone. So basically, everything that's a negative experience of life is a result of this trigger. It's not part of our natural homeostasis. It means that we're in a primal fight or flight response. So again, so we get threat of imminent death. We trigger norepinephrine, epinephrine, and histamine, which is a fight or flight response, fight or flight state of consciousness, which then creates suffering in our life. So that's our first state, is the state of suffering. Again, the brain thinks we're dying. It triggers norepinephrine, triggering a fight or flight response, which creates the suffering. We have to remember that. Suffering does not create fight or flight, right? Fight or flight is often called the stress chemical. Stress doesn't trigger fight or flight. We're feeling stress because the fight or flight mechanism's been triggered. I mean, that's the biggest thing to get, right?